Hello, good afternoon. I'm afraid we have lost one of our speakers, but we still hope that he'll be coming soon. Maybe he was lost in the first district somehow. I always do this all the time because it's a circle, like you can get lost easily. My name is Desi Gavrilova, and I will be moderating this afternoon session, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Human Sciences, the Institute für die Wissenschaften von Menschen, to this third and last part of the lecture series called Reading Russian Philosophy in the Age of Putin. The lecture series is organized by the World in Pieces program of the Institute, whose research director, Klemena Antonova, will be one of the speakers this afternoon, and she's also the mastermind behind this lecture series. I will say a few words about Nikolai Mitrokhin as well, because he'll be coming, I hope, soon. But then I will introduce also both of them, and Klemena, and depending whether he'll be here by the time I'm finished, we might start with Klemena. But last but not least, I would like to thank Presseclub Concordia, which is our host today, and which is a very good partner in crime to the Institute, always ready to have a meaningful collaboration with the Institute. Thank you. The topic of this afternoon session will be the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian-Ukrainian War. And we will hear hopefully two short lectures, hopefully two. Nikolai Mitrokhin, hopefully is going to be one of our speakers. And I was intrigued by the topic of his talk because it, in a way, puts a question mark on something that I thought is a given, is a fact. His talk is entitled, "Does the Russian Orthodox Church support the Russian aggression in Ukraine?" Nikolai Mitrokhin is a Russian historian, sociologist of religion, and political analyst who is currently an associate fellow at the Research Center for East European Studies at the Bremen University. He has been educated and earned his PhD at Russian State University for the Humanities. His academic interest led him to research the Russian Orthodox Church, and he has also been doing an extensive study of Orthodox religiosity in Ukraine. He's author of several books, I'll mention a few: Bishops and Eparchies of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russian, published in Russian, Economic Activity of the Russian Orthodox Church in the year 2000, and the Russian Orthodox Church, Contemporary Condition and Actual Problems. Last but not least, he also has worked, I found this interesting, in the Memorial Human Rights Center for 6 years altogether. Let me introduce Klemena Antonova, who is a historian with interest in Russian religious philosophy, and more generally in the role of religion in modernity and the question of visuality. Klemena has earned her PhD at the Oxford University, where her PhD thesis has been published in the form of a book entitled Space, Time and Presence in the Icon, Seeing the World with the Eyes of God. The book was published in 2010. Her second book is Visual Thought in Russian Religious Philosophy. It came out in Routledge in 2019, and The Icon and Visual Arts in the Time of the Russian Religious Renaissance in the Oxford Handbook for Russian Religious Thought. Klemena, as I already mentioned, is the research director of the World in Pieces program at the Institute for Human Sciences and the curator and initiator of this lecture series. Her talk today is entitled, What Have Gay Parades Have to Do with the Russian-Ukrainian War? Klemena, I think the floor is yours now.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Now, out of politeness, I was planning to be the second speaker, but as Nikolai has mysteriously disappeared. Now, hopefully, he will show up at some point. I will start first. Now, we decided with Nikolai that we wanted to do, as in the previous two parts of the lecture series, a joint talk, which basically means to talk on the same topic but coming from completely different directions. So the idea was that Nikolai would do a historical reading, I would do a theological reading. And we are both starting with a question, which is quite a small, concrete question relating to bigger and hopefully more important questions. So my question is, the concrete question is, what have gay parades got to do with the war? And this concrete question is part of a larger question. Generally, when in all my work on the Russian Orthodox Church, my guiding research interest has been to what an extent developments within the Russian Church are typically Russian, so they grow out of Russian culture and Russian history and so on. To what an extent they're characteristic of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In this sense, are they in any ways typical of Eastern Orthodox Christianity and thus different or distinct from, let's say, Catholic Christianity, Protestant Christianity, secular philosophy, and so on? Or are these developments that I'm interested in, are they in some way typical of larger tendencies that in a way transcend local specificities and so on? So these are the questions that are always in my background, and they are there in, they have been behind my motivation of this research. I think that, in academic terms, this would be called comparative research. In everyday terms, I keep coming across a word that we were discussing yesterday with Randall, our latest speaker. You keep coming across the derogatory term, whataboutism, that people are constantly asking questions, oh, Nikolai, well, there's the mystery man. Well, you did manage to attract a lot of attention. I'm telling you, nobody's going to forget you. So you can sit here if you like. So, so in other words, I'll be asking a lot questions such as, if this is the position of the Russian Church, what about the way this is formulated by the Catholic Church? What about the way these views are formulated in secular philosophy, and so on and so forth? Now, the reason I'm interested in these questions is that, as many of you know, there's a very common widespread view that in some way the Russian Orthodox Church hasn't been able to deal as successfully with modernity as Western Christianity. So I'd like to see to what an extent this is true, if it is true, in what sense it is true, and so on. So this is in the background of what I'll be talking about. So let me go back to my interest in, gay parades. So when the war, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, the Russian Patriarch gave several sermons. And this wasn't surprising to anyone who has been following the Patriarch, positions coming from the Russian Orthodox Church. So there was no surprise there. He, of course, supported the war, and he justified the war. So in some way, there's nothing very unusual about that. No need to go back to the Crusades. In history, there have been many, many cases of spiritual leaders that have justified, encouraged war, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think that the position in which the Patriarch found himself is, if not completely unique, it is quite exceptional. At the start of the war, Patriarch Kirill was the acknowledged spiritual leader, not just of Orthodox Christians in Russia, but of a large part of the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine as well. The greater body of Orthodox Christians in Ukraine were under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. So in this sense, when the Patriarch came out and supported the war, encouraged the war in some sense, he was actually, quite literally, justifying one part of his flock killing another part of his flock. Now, there are not many historical precedents for that. That is quite exceptional. So I think that it is something that is worth keeping in mind when we look at the rhetoric coming out from the Patriarch and from the Church. Now, usually, when you actually look at these sermons from the beginning of the war and still going on to the present, one of the things that immediately attracts attention is how much attention is being paid to denouncing gay rights. So it is a very natural question. What have gay parades in Amsterdam or Berlin got to do with the war in Ukraine? How is it all right to bomb innocent people in Ukraine because of gay parades, no matter what you think about gay rights? Now, usually, most scholars and people who deal with this question look at this, these positions from the point of view that put them as part of the whole context of the anti-Western positions of the Russian Orthodox Church. So I'm suggesting to do something different. I would like to look at this whole rhetoric around gay rights in the context of the war against the background of the position of the Russian Orthodox Church on human rights and human dignity. And this is a position that has been articulated, especially in three official documents that came out in the last 20 years. My colleague and friend Randall will talk more, I think, about them later on. So I'll just mention the time period. The first document came out in 2000, the second one in 2006, the third one in 2008. And the third one is actually called Basic Teaching on Human Dignity, Freedom, and Rights. Now, the reason that I'm attracting your attention to the title is pay attention to the connection between dignity and rights, because this is something that is important for my concerns. So one of the themes that comes out in these three documents is that there is a difference between what in Russian is called ценность, so value, worth, and dostoinство, so dignity. For example, let me read to you a quote from the document in 2006. We distinguish between human worth and dignity. Worth is given, while dignity is acquired. Now, there is a very well-known to theologians and believers background to this sort of distinction between human worth and human dignity. And it is based on a theological distinction that goes back to the 4th century patristic writings and so on, which is the theological pair of icon, of image and likeness. And this is what I'd like to show you here. Can we have my slide? So it's not such a great slide, but let me just tell you where this, where this theological distinction comes from and where I find the problem with it. So basically, image likeness comes from the Old Testament, Genesis 1:26, where, as you all know, it is said that man is created in the image and likeness of God. So in other words, in the biblical text, image and likeness are synonyms. Later on, in patristic literature, starting from the 4th century onwards, image and likeness become two distinct terms. They're different. So you see, when I say image versus likeness, I'm talking about the patristic tradition of thinking on this terminology. And it's very important for the writings of the Russian Orthodox Church because they're based on the distinction between image and likeness. So I think that what is happening there is that when you claim that human dignity is based on the image or likeness of man's image and likeness to God, you see how in patristic texts, very often the same author goes from one understanding to another. So on the one hand, there is the idea that dignity is an inherent quality. It is unconditional. All human beings have it because all human beings have the image of God. Now, at the same time, when you connect, when you base dignity on likeness, what you're saying is that dignity is based on likeness that is a process through which some human beings go and they attain likeness to God. So you see that you're saying two quite different things. At the same time, over and over again, you see the same theologians within the same text going from one to the other. And you see that this is exactly the distinction between likeness and image is what you see and what comes across in these documents by the Russian Church. Now, let me read to you another quote, and then I'll go back to the theological background. So, in Orthodoxy, this is what the document from 2008 says. In Orthodoxy, dignity and the ultimate worth of every human person are derived from the image of God. This is quite theologically correct. While dignified life is related to the notion of God's likeness, achieved through God's grace by efforts to overcome sin and to seek moral purity and virtue. So, in other words, what we are talking about here is that on the one hand, you have dignity as a quality that everybody has, and dignity as a way of life, a process that only some attain to. Can we move to the next slide now? So there's my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that it's not just a matter of that there is a tension between these two understandings of human dignity. I'm going to claim that there's an irreconcilable difference. It's either one or the other. Dignity is either a quality that we all have, and therefore every human being has dignity, or dignity becomes a process that some people go successfully through and others don't. Now, when you go from there and you connect dignity with human rights, which is a connection that is very typical of modern ways of thinking about human rights, and it is a connection that the Russian Church's teaching builds on. What you are basically saying there is that in the one case, everybody has human rights because everybody has dignity, right? In the other case, what you're saying is that some people somehow have less rights than others because they have less dignity. And there are those people who have no dignity at all, and therefore they have or may be completely deprived of rights. So you see that these two views are quite different. Now, at some point in my readings, I thought that the problem is the Christian articulation of this position, that the problem lay with the distinction between image and likeness. And then I looked at pagan writings on dignity, secular understandings of dignity, so before and after Christianity. And I see there the same tension between these two understandings. For example, if you think of Roman writings, the Latin notion of dignitas, like in Cicero, on the one hand, you have this idea, let me see where I have this, where basically, well, I don't have it here, but in short, you know, in Cicero, you have the same tension between, on the one hand, in one of his texts, which is called On Duties, he talks about dignity as a quality that people have by virtue of being human. On the other hand, he talks about dignity as honor. Some people have more honor. Some people have less honor. This has to do with lots of things, including how you live your life and so on. And if you agree with me that these are quite different ways of thinking about dignity and they're irreconcilable, basically you see this tension already in Latin writings that precede Christianity. Now, if you move later on to secular understandings of dignity, Desi, how much time do I have? Okay, yeah, I'm very talkative, so I keep, I keep worrying that I'll go on and on and on. So, okay, I'm sort of getting there. So, so I need another 10 minutes. So, let's move then to secular understandings of dignity. And the most common and widespread and most familiar to everyone is Kant's understanding of dignity. And I think that the way Kant is usually referred to is that he's in a way the most extreme example of someone who holds this understanding of dignity that every human being shares by virtue of being human. You know, somewhere in his most famous text on dignity is the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And there he says, humanity is dignity. So everyone who is human has dignity. At the same time, even in Kant, even though this is a minor aspect, you have this idea running through that dignity is something that has to do with rational agency. So people who have rationality and people who have rationality by nature. So it has to do with rational agency, and also dignity belongs to those who accept and follow the moral law. So then you ask your question, yourself, well, what about those who don't? Do they have dignity? So in other words, even in Kant, I think you have this sort of contradiction between these two understandings. In other words, what I've thought at some points of my research and reading of, literature around that, this contradiction and tension is only something which is typical of Christian thought, and it has to do with the very attempt of formulating dignity through this theological framework of image and likeness. I think is not quite correct. I think the understanding of dignity from antiquity up to the present has this contradiction coming up at times. Now, if this is true, I think that this might be one of the reasons why you see actually quite a lot of philosophers and thinkers who feel uncomfortable with the notion of dignity. I think because they realize that there is this sort of contradiction running through it. Nietzsche was very dismissive of the whole notion. Schopenhauer had quite a lot of malicious, comical things to say about it. Marx was also quite dismissive of dignity, saying that you're basically turning history into morality and things like that. And I think that the reason for that is partly this contradiction at the heart of the concept itself. And I think that in a way it is no surprise in this sense that the notion of human rights, which actually has a much shorter history than the concept of dignity. Dignity goes on for several hundred years. Human rights, the very notion of rights is actually modern. It has to do with Enlightenment philosophy developments around the American, the French Revolution, and so on. And it is noteworthy that actually the American Declaration of Independence talks about rights. There's no mention of dignity. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Again, there is talk of rights, not of dignity. Rousseau talks about rights, liberty, freedom, but not dignity. So in other words, this sort of connection between rights and dignity, which is something that comes out in the UN Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War. And then you have the same connection in these documents by the Russian Orthodox Church, is actually quite a modern connection in the sense that the discourse on human dignity and the discourse on human rights are two separate discourses. When you bring them together, I think, you end up with this sort of contradiction between these two understandings. And this is why my sort of, I don't know if it's a conclusion, it's an idea that I would like to think through myself. And if anyone has any insights about that, you can also tell me how you feel about that. But basically, I would say that because there is this tension in the notion of dignity, what we need to do is to rethink the very common and largely unquestioned connection between human dignity and rights, that human rights are based on human dignity. You know, I think it's something that needs to be thought through better, you know. So I think this is more or less what I wanted to say. And if you have any comments, suggestions, and so on, they're very welcome because as you can see, and I think I gave you some idea about this is very much for me work in progress. These are still questions I've been thinking about. For my own research, they're quite important. So it's not just a matter of academic interest, but these are issues that I think are really important for us to confront and think through. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Clemena. Very interesting, but please keep your comments and questions for the end. And I would like now to give the floor to Nikolai Matrokhin. In your absence, I have introduced you. I said some things about you that you'll never know what I said. But I mentioned that I'm intrigued by the question mark of your title. Does the Russian Orthodox Church support the Russian aggression in Ukraine? So the floor is yours.
It's all okay. Sorry for my delay. My German's handy refused to find this club. I have no idea why. When we talk about the participation of the Russian Orthodox Church in aggression, we have the very bright picture from the media and the statement politics, especially Ukrainians. The Russia fight in Ukraine for Russian world. The idea of Russian world, it's idea of Patriarch Kirill. So the Patriarch Kirill is the main ideologist of the Putin's regime. And if the Patriarch Kirill support the war, all Russian Orthodox Church support the war. Last but not least, the Orthodox so important for Russia that the soldiers in the front line is the Orthodox. As a couple of days ago, say me, brilliant Orthodox women from the Kiev. I'm studied the Russian Orthodox Church near 30 years, and I'm glad to present Russian Orthodox Church like the most powerful influence political and religious group in the former Soviet Union, and which pressed to Russian society with their homophobic and fundamentalist idea and conservatism and so on. But last 10 years, I have to deconstruct this image. First of all, because the Russian Orthodox Church is the church of minorities in the Russia. Just not more than 2% of the population really visited the churches. Most of these people don't want to listen Patriarch, because the Patriarch have the very controversial image inside the church. For one group, he is too liberal, for another, too conservative. And nobody from the church, between the priest or the ordinary believers, will be repeat something which say Patriarch. Patriarch say not for the believers, not for the priest. Patriarch say for the power. He is a representative of the Russian Orthodox Church between the power, first of all. But all spiritual influence, all intellectual influence, and so on, give a huge number of another spiritual authorities, which are the elders, which are really interested in the believers. And again, so we started from the beginning. Russia don't fight in Ukraine for the Russian world. When the Putin in his speech, and lately Medvedev in his speech, talked about the reasons of the aggression against the Ukraine, no one say about the Russian world. He talked about the military targets, he talked about the political targets, he talked about their own nationalism and the national building targets. But the repression against the Orthodox Church in Ukraine was one of 20 reasons which Putin say in his speech, and it was not on the first position. Second one, Patriarch is not the outer idea of the Russian world. Idea of the Russian world, what was formulated and translated to power in the end of 19th from the group of the Moscow intellectuals, which are politologists and commercial manipulator of the elections with the head of the Petr Shchedrovitsky, so-called Shchedrovityane. Now Petr Shchedrovitsky is political immigrant in Latvia, or non-political immigrant at Latvia. And Patriarch used this, imagine this word, Russian word, just in the short period of time when the Russian Orthodox Church tried to promote foundation Russian word with Russian organization Россотрудничество, Russian Russian State Department for Communication with Russian immigration. And this moment, the Russian Orthodox Church started to use this impression, and then used that really 2016. If you try to see the site of Moscow Patriarchate, you can find for last 1.5 years, just one time, in this site is all interview or all speeches of the Patriarch and many others of the top church top. Just one time they used the word, the impression Russian word. And it was not Patriarch, but his speechwriter who remembering the book Patriarch 2016. In this reason, we can say that the Patriarch is not the main ideologist of the Putin regime. The list of the ideologists of the Putin regime, it's 30 or 40 person from the regisseur Nikita Mikhalkov until the quasi-Orthodox publicist Igor Kholmogorov. The Putin used his ideas in his speeches. But it was no, I couldn't remember that Putin used the Patriarch Kirill speeches in his speech. public declaration. And in this list, the first ideologue of the contemporary Russia is the Putin self. And the one of the last position on the list of the public ideologists of the Russia is the Patriarch Kirill. We can evaluate that from the link for him in the real speeches of the Russian public figure, not from the foreign press, but really how it's used in the Russia. If you visited, for example, the meeting inside the Putin administration or nearby, you can find a crowd, a person who publicly is near the null person, but this person wrote the speeches for the public figure in the Putin administration. They provide their own meeting where they formulate the next stadium, the national idea, and try to solve these ideas, the most influenced figure in the Putin's administration. They have the special premiere, special magazines, special sites, and so on. In the West, nobody, or the new nobody knows about or evaluated that and so on, because it's too much, too complicated, and you have to have some sources inside the Putin's or near the Putin's administration, or intellectual centers and think tank that understand what is important, what is not. Is it the voice of the Patriarch, voice of the Russian Orthodox Church? Yes or not? Putin has four different, Patriarch Kirill has four official positions inside the Russian Orthodox Church. He is the leader of Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church. He is the leader of the Russian part of the Russian Orthodox Church. He is the leader of the Moscow diocese. And he is the leader of the common Moscow diocese in the Moscow region diocese. In every his position, he has to communicate with the power, with the business, for some common church reasons, and have the correct statement for the different target group. But it is these speeches in this position, but not the speeches, but not the position of the church. The position of the church, the Orthodox, is different from the Catholic Church. If in the Catholic Church, voice of the Pope of the Rome is the really important and give basement for some church, real church deals, real church ideology. In the Russian Orthodox Church, voice of the Patriarch, it's lowly than the voice of the common boards of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Holy Synod is a real voice of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Council of the Bishops is really voice of the Russian Orthodox Church, who support the idea of the decision of the Holy Synod. The common meeting of the Russian Orthodox Church is the most important source of the church tradition and so on, but it's collected very rarely. If we take a look for the decision of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church for 1.5 years, we found near null decision about the support of the war. It was just one decision to the text of prayer for the Holy Rus, which support allocated mostly for parishes in Russia, not for all Russian Orthodox Church. And if we take a look for the position, on the personal position of the members of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, they openly support the war just representative of the Central Asia. Between 12 or 13 members of the Holy Synod, only Patriarch Kirill and only representative of the Central Asia support the war, personally. It means that the Russian Orthodox Church at whole, in general, keep the same position like the whole Russian society. And the whole Russian society openly support the war, promote very small and radical part of the society, it's 10-15% for the different evaluation, who is pro-war party. Mostly it's military or military veterans or their relatives. And we have the opposition of the war in the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's a representative member of this Holy Synod from the Ukraine, the leader of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, who make the very hard statement against the war, against the Russia war after the start. The leader of the, for example, Russian Orthodox Church abroad also make this statement, and a lot of bishops outside the Russia in the Western country also openly disagree with war. But the most bishops, priests, and so on take the position to neutrality to the war. In this big field, media, in media reality, try to find the position, because if the not position, we couldn't talk with readers about the nothing. The media try to find pro and contra position. They found inside the Russia pro position, because really in Moscow is the group of priests the same, who openly supports the war, very aggressive impressions. Most of these priests come to Moscow from Ukraine, by the way. And at the same time, they found the dissidents inside the Russian Orthodox Church were stronger opposite the war inside the Russia, and then a couple of them have to immigrate from near 300 persons who in the beginning support manifest against the war. We can say that yes, Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in his political position, it's very aggressive, pro-fascist, because his ideas about the society, about the human rights, about the intelligentsia, about the Russian nationalism, their support and so on, it's a pro-fascist ideas. It's very near to ideas of the Italian fascism of the 20th years. And around the Patriarch exists the group of very radical pro-fascist speakers, some of them priests, some of them they are not priests, but the publicists. They have the open fascist organization near the Moscow Patriarchate. It's so-called 40-40, the organization which combined the former neo-Nazis, fascist, Russian nationalist, football hooligans, and so on, who forbidden forbidden the Orthodox interest in the country. But this is organization not more than 40 person or 50 person. This is personal patriarch party inside the Russian Orthodox Church and around the Orthodox Church. But at the same time, the apparatus of Moscow Patriarchate, the nominal church structure with the central apparatus, diocese structure, department of the Russian Orthodox Church, in general, try to stay opposite to war. Yes, of course, 2 or 3 departments of the Moscow Patriarchate involved the war. It's a it's a department which collaborated with the army and another so-called siloviki, military military units of the Russian forces. Another involved into the help of the refugees from the zone of military conflict, but refugees to Russia. But in general, if you take account the mining of the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, what did they say for the last year and a half? Most of these bishops say nothing. They will talk about the all things in the world, but not only about the war. Of course, we in the West wanted that the people in Russia all stay in the protest and openly say that we are not support the war, we are in opposition and so on. But into my mind, the situation in Russia, it's not the democratic country. It's not now the autocratic country. It's more moving to open dictator. If in the Soviet time, nobody really in the West wanted from the bishop of the Orthodox Church or the priest of Orthodox Church, then they openly say in the main square of the city, we are against the Communist Party, we are openly anti-communist, we are not support the war in Afghanistan. Of course, for West, support this guy if they found. But the really, why the questions, why the priests have more answer for the society than another category of the Russian people, teacher or something like that. The pretension here, in my mind, it's like the pretension of the common Russian society. Russian society now in the dictator. That's all. And last but not least, why the Russian Orthodox really influence for the soldiers or not? It's a problem of the moral categories and so on. But Russian soldiers, it's not Orthodox. Russian soldiers believe in if they want to believe, they can believe in different ideas. A lot of the paganists, for example, between the soldiers. Or a lot of the Muslims, for example. If we take a look at the statistic, Russian Orthodox Church has just 60 priests in the front line. 60 permanent priest capellans and near the 60th person who visited time to time. It's for near 500,000 people. So the real interest to the soldiers, to the priest, is very low. From Ukrainian side, the number of the priests around 3 times more, but also not so big. And this situation, it's not you. I wrote the article that the Russian army frustrated to the Russian Orthodox Church in 2005, when the really ideas that the priests come to the army and then mass of the soldiers and officers will be participate in the church ceremony and so in the practice doesn't work. In some places were organized the army churches, but mostly for initiative for the head of the army units, but not for initiative of the soldiers or officers or priests. And this moment, I go to the end, the main ideology in Russia, this ideology of the Russian militarism. And we have, I have dozens and dozens meetings and the public discussion about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the war, around the war, Russian ideology and so on. But I never seen the press conference or another public events about the role of the Russian militarist ideology, which has really influence, which has a lot of supporters, and which connected now with idea of the Russian nationalism. For example, when I started to see when the Putin really started to be Russian nationalist, a couple times on openly say about yourself and Medvedev were good Russian nationalists. And when he first time tried to talk about the rules of Russians and so on, we moved strictly to the beginning of 90s. In this moment, Putin and his chef Sobchak in this time, first one talked about the Crimea problem, about the rules of Russians and so on. Putin's relationship with the military Russian nationalist underground we can find also in the beginning of 90s when he was the deputy chief in the St. Petersburg city administration. And from this reason, I evaluate the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the contemporary Russia is most represented in the media than it's really life, and especially in the aggression, what the Patriarch don't say publicly.
Thank you very much. I will open now. Thank you. Applause. I will open now the floor to questions. So if and comments. So show me a hand. There will be a microphone coming your way. But I would like to start. Yeah, I think there will be the first. The first after mine, though, because I have an immediate question to you, Nikolai.
Graag een beetje
And it is
oh, sorry.
just to fit. I'm misusing my position. I'm sorry. Having a priority here, but because the question is immediate to what we just heard from you. If I'm not mistaken, there are about 60% of the Russian population that identify themselves as Orthodox. Is that right, more or less, the number? And you just said that about 2% of them go to church, right? So my question is, do you know, what do they think, the so-called late Christians in Russia, what do they think that the Russian Orthodox Church's position on the war is? Because if you don't go to church, how would you learn actually what is the position of the Holy Synod, etc.? What you learn about the Orthodox Church, I guess, comes from the media, from TV, etc. And who is there? It's the Patriarch. So then it's very easy as an Orthodox Russian to say, my church is pro-war, so this is why I am.
It's so simply the reality and reality of the sociological pools. It's two different reality. It's a problem when the sociologist asks someone about you are a man or a woman, or you are gay or you are strong. The man answered or the women answered for these questions. But what they really think about yourself in some concrete situation, it's a big question. And about the pools about the religiosity, the same problem. It's a more concrete problem. It's a more promote question. How many person visit the church last Sunday? Sociologists after that say, wow, we really found the people who visited the churches, especially it's popular in Ukraine. The problem is that the number of the person who answered sociologists for they was in the church the last Sunday, 10, 15 times more that really visited the church. We can evaluate how many people really visited the church, just visited the church, and counted how many people is in the church service, how many people can get inside the churches in the Sunday. And the number of this, I made personally this research, and the reality, it's 10 or more time difference from the second one. When the Patriarch openly support the war, Patriarch openly support the war in his speeches inside the cathedral of the Moscow Patriarchate in the Moscow. How many persons participate in this church service? In the best way, 1,000. is it translate state media Patriarch's speech inside the cathedral? No. In the ordinary service, no, just at Pesach or something like that. It's his speeches then translated to the site of the Moscow Patriarchate, and then crowd of the journalists from the international media, not from Russian media, because in Russian media doesn't really interested of that, most of them. Try to find what the Patriarch say to the believers. Oh, they say Russia always was involved in the war. Russian was always patriots. Russians fighting with enemies. That's all, in general. Really, Patriarch is not near the null of his speeches openly support the war concrete in Ukraine. His speeches were always around the historical examples. Oh, Russian was burning in the cathedral of Smolensk, but just not to go to enemies in the hands. Say Patriarch when in general talked about the atom answer for atom attack against the Ukraine. Okay, of course, it's a support of the state ideology in general, but it's very tiny and for very small auditorium.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, most fascinating. I'm actually from an institute, Danube region, Central Europe, but I have a question, first of all, to Mr. Mitrokhin. When we think back, the previous Patriarch, I'm not aware of the name, he was much less as a politician than Kirill is, and Kirill seems to have had already links to Putin for quite a time before, and in some media it was said that he may have been close to KGB. I don't know if this was ever an issue in Russia when one still could talk openly about things. And I have a question to Ms. Mrs. Andronova, concerning this whole issue of dignity. Now, you have said human dignity, inherent quality of human beings, okay. And what we hear, not only from Putin, but also his speakers, is actually that Ukrainians who are not ready to become Russians, they have no dignity at all, yeah? This is only one step from the period of National Socialism, when the Jewish had no dignity at all and not even considered humans. Now, how do you see this situation about human dignity and the actual policy of Mr. Putin? Thank you.
I don't understand the real question. Was Patriarch Kirill?
If in public or in private, better in private probably, it was ever discussed among society, but also in the church, that Kirill had a very strong political backing, maybe not so much religious backing from others. How was that when he became elected in 2016? And it is said, and I don't know if that was ever discussed about, that he had some KGB links.
In Russian society, nobody interested in KGB links. When the president of the country is a KGB man, if a lot of the representative of the society is the KGB man, okay, if the patriarch has some network with the KGB, of course, a lot of the people has the network with the KGB. It's not the stigma in the Russian society. We can remember that the patriarch of the ecumenical patriarch was the officer of the Turkish army. Okay, is it important for the activity in the Ukraine or not? These people have some biographies, yeah, and for ordinary Russian believers who are most of them former members of the Communist Party or the former Komsomol members, it's not null position to the someone from the church position has the some relation. Another problem, if this person, some person inside the church, provide the KGB line now. And this church is a couple bishops who are very closely to the KGB, or the FSB now. And they're like the person of the FSB inside the church. I have to say that in near the every big church organization in the former Soviet Union is some person who are direct connected with the secret services, and like the person who represented secret services in every concrete country. In Ukraine, for example, Ukrainian churches also bishops over there. And for this person is the common church opposition. They are not provide this person in more real powerful position. For example, the Bishop Metropolitan Tikhon now in the Russian Orthodox Church, who represents FSB in the Russian Orthodox Church, he moved to the Pskov. Pskov is the borderland. He had the third level department, the common church department in the ruling, the culture. Nobody in the Russian Orthodox Church really interested in the culture. And stay in this position for years and years. The press, of course, talked about the candidate of the in the next patriarch, but he never will be in the candidate in this patriarch because he has not the position inside the church structure which give him opportunity to promote this candidature to the post position patriarch.
And I'd like to respond to what you just said. I completely agree. And, you know, this has to do, I think, with, you know, what I think is quite interesting here, that we tend to think when we hear the word dignity, that it's obviously something very positive. If you see of how the term and the concept has been used throughout history, you sort of realize that it's a very ambivalent concept. You know, for example, think of this very notorious you know, case in Chile during the 1970s. There was the Colonia Dignidad. It's one way in which the term is being used. And, you know, what they were doing there, basically, it was organized by mainly, you know, German Catholics that had moved to Chile after the Second World War. And in the 1970s, it became a center for torture of political opposition. So the thing is that I think that I'm always very intrigued when I hear these obviously positive connotations of certain terms. And then when we look into them and we see how they've been used in history, we see that they're so ambivalent. And then you want to know why. Why are they so ambivalent? And I think that this is, I'm sure there are probably many other levels there that I haven't quite thought through, but I think that there is this sort of tension that I just spoke about, which I think opens the concept to being used in these different ways. Because, you know, I think it is a very normal thing. You tend to think of, you know, Nelson Mandela cannot have as much dignity and worth as a torturer during the Chilean regime, for example. But at the same time, the moment you start thinking about dignity in terms of some people have it and some don't, then you open the concept itself to being misused in all sorts of different ways, you know, so.
Thank you. Now we have 4 questions. I'll give you 5, okay? So I suggest that you just give your comments or questions in one go, and then you take notes, and then you conclude with the answers.
I have nothing to take notes with. Yeah.
Give you.
Okay. Yes.
Mirjana first.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Mirjana Tomic. I work for Press Group Concordia and organize conferences and seminars. I am fascinated by both of you, and but I have a very short comment and a very short and a question. When it comes to dignity, Klimena. I'm not a philosopher and I don't know much about religion, but I come from Serbia, that is an Orthodox country. And it seems to me that when you speak of dignity in countries like Russia or Serbia, it's a collective thing. It's not an individual thing. Well, when you speak about dignity, and I'm only speaking about perceptions and nowadays, when you speak in Western Europe, you're talking about sick people and euthanasia and dignity at the end of life or dignity of poor people or whatever. You know, it is a totally different concept. And dignity, from what I have seen in my country of origin, has nothing to do with individual well-being. It has to do with political manipulation. And I would like you to comment on that. And the second comment question to Nikolai is it the same in Russia that identity and religion are like the same thing? So you say, you're Russian, therefore you are an Orthodox, and it doesn't mean that people have even read the Bible. You have said very correctly, most communists are now Orthodox. I would say in my country of origin, communists have never read Marx and Engels, and Orthodox have never read the Bible. So it's really not about religion at all. It's all about politics and a very dangerous connection between religion and identity. So when you talk about synod, etc., it's only a few people who understand. On the other hand, if you say orthodoxy, it's your identity, then it becomes more dangerous. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask a question to Klimena regarding the contrasting of human rights and dignity. So, because my question is, isn't it so that the concept of human rights, ever since we've had this concept, implies dignity in the first place, which is why we can say that there is this problem of contrasting the two, because human rights is a legislatable legal concept, whereas dignity is, I don't know if you can legally define it, it's probably hard to define legally. It's not a legal concept. So this is maybe a problem about the contrast of the two. So I wonder what you say about that.
Yeah, thank you both of you. It was very fascinating, and these parallel worlds. So I have one small comment and one question. Comment to Klimena's. So you started with this point that Patriarch supporting the war was in a very unusual historical situation. But in fact, we have a very close historical parallel, especially here. I mean, South German Catholic priests and Austrian Catholic priests after full-scale invasion of Third Reich to Poland. It was the same, absolutely the same situation, and the invasion was accompanied by mass killing, not only soldiers and Poland men, but also by Poland priests, Catholic priests. So it is very interesting. And my question so it is interesting to compare some argumentation what they were saying at that time. I mean, Catholic priests here and in South Germany. And my question to Nikolai, I absolutely agree with you. The picture convincing picture you described, and with this ambivalent understanding of what Orthodoxy is in mass consciousness in Russia, but what is important, I think, for it's the Russians don't care what patriarchs really thinks about war, what priests think about war, what Church, Orthodox Church are thinking about war. But what is politically important is if there's no split between Orthodox Church and state. And my question is, if on some occasion, just imagine, it would be some split, some opposition of church officials to the state. What will happen? What will be impression? What will be the result? The influence on the society?
So yeah, thank you. Very interesting on both sides. A little bit of background for my question. Last fall, I was at a major Slavic studies conference, and I was attending a roundtable on the current invasion of Ukraine. And I like asking provocative questions. So the questions I asked the roundtable was, could one of the long-term outcomes of this war be that Ukraine replaces Russia as a major regional power? It's a very speculative question, and it led to this wide range of answers. But the reason I bring this up now is, in a way, the most interesting answer came from a woman who was a religious studies professor and said she thinks it's possible that the center of sort of Orthodox influence the world will shift over towards Ukraine. And if I remember her reasoning, the idea was that Ukrainian Orthodox Church is much better at adapting itself to kind of the 21st century and modern values. So I kind of want to repeat that question. Could this war, and specifically the Russian Orthodox Church's position or the Patriarch's position, lead to undermining its authority relative to Ukrainian Orthodoxy? And then I guess specifically for Klimena, is there a tension between different branches of Orthodoxy that plays with both sides of the term dignity? If you see what I mean.
Okay, Kim.
Last chance, someone else has a question to show me their hand. No.
Yeah, hi, Kim Shepley from Princeton. So fascinating talks. And I have a question for both of you. So one is this odd position that the Russian Orthodox Church was in at the start of the war, which is that it not only controlled the church in Russia, but it controlled a big chunk of the Orthodox believers in Ukraine. And of course, that's obviously stopped, both because the Ukrainian government has banned the Russian-based church in Ukraine, but also because many Ukrainian believers obviously move from one church to the other. So one of the questions I have is whether the split between the two churches is theological or more political. I mean, it's like hard to sustain once one country invades another, that the church from one should operate in the other. But was there already a theological split? Is there something more to this than simply support for the war on the part of Kirill? Is there some difference in the doctrine of the two churches? And then for Klimena, I mean, we have so much. There's a longer conversation I want to have with you about this, but the short version is that in the Catholic tradition, the idea of dignitas starts as that property possessed by kings that ordinary people don't possess, right? So it's the thing that makes somebody special, rather like I guess it's likeness, right? The thing that one aspires to. But what it doesn't do in the Catholic tradition is then mean that those who don't have it have nothing, right? What it means is that those who have it have the obligation, and we might now say the right, to guide others toward it, right? Which is to say, it's a thing about hierarchy and superiority rather than all or nothing possession. And there was sort of an idea, and this is where the modern idea comes from, right? That dignitas becomes, or the modern idea of human dignity becomes the idea of what Jim Whitman, who's traced the history of this, calls leveling up, right? As egalitarianism comes to dominate as a Western value, then the question is, do people fail to have any dignitas because nobody's a king anymore? Or does everybody come to have this property that kings once possessed? And the Enlightenment view basically levels up, right? So that dignitas comes to be possessed by all. So the way that you described it, Klimena, was rather that you start with dignity for all and then some get better at it. But I'm wondering if the history isn't the other way around, right? Which is that, at least in the Catholic tradition, some start with it and then others get it by virtue of the onset of egalitarianism in the modern age, which then goes to the question both of you raised, which is, can the Orthodox Church keep up with modernity?
Thank you very much. I hope you noted all your questions, and I would like to ask Nikolai to start with the answers.
About the identities, it's a huge question, but in general, Russia is not the Balkanian. Balkanians is not the Russia. The questions of the religious identity in Russia, it's not the reasons to hit under a person, attacked under a person, because between the Russian, number of the Russian real Orthodox, number of Russian which are really Protestant, and number of Russian who are really Muslims, the same. And it's not the real conflict between each other, like especially aggression. The aggression in Russia, which provoked in the 2000-2010 from Russian skinheads and Nazi movement, most of them was the paganist in his religious ideas, but not the the reason why they attack the people with another color of the body was not the religious, but ethnic, racist, and so on. And for soldiers in the front, and a lot of the notes in Telegram channels, there are very rarely or near the null reasons why they started to war, come to the war. It was some religious reasons, because from opposite side, the same members of the Orthodox Church, most of them, the same church were members of them. Ukrainian Orthodox Church was the part of the Russian Orthodox Church. And so the real religious reason in this war in near the null. If we talked about the reasons why the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was 100% separate now, near the 100% from the Russian Church, of course, non-theological. It's political reasons, the main reasons. And the second, it's a personal conflict between Patriarch Kirill and Metropolitan Onufriy. And because the Patriarch Kirill too liberal from the side of Metropolitan Onufriy, Patriarch Kirill initiated the meeting with the Pope of the Rome. Don't ask about the Ukrainian part of the Russian Orthodox Church and so on. Patriarch Kirill wanted to participate in the Crete meeting, the Common Orthodox. Don't ask the Ukrainian part of the Russian Orthodox Church and so on. It's not like strong theological, but more church political church discussion. And Kirill, just could you remember? That for both for state and for Russian people, it is important.
It is important that there's no split between state and church. And if on some occasion it would be some split.
Ukrainian situation show us that it doesn't matter. Ukrainian Orthodox Church now in the conflict with the state attacked the church and demand some, but members of this church fighting against the Russians, not against the Ukraine, most of them. So it doesn't matter. If the Russian Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church stay the dissident and say, no, we are not support the, nobody from the soldiers refused to fight for this reason. Or the null, near the null of them. Because most of them, or the member of very radical, not church structures, or the paganist or Buddhist, like the Minister of the Defense, or Muslims and so on. Or most of them is atheist or non-believers.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you all for these very, very interesting questions. I think they show either that I have many empty spaces there or that it's an interesting topic. So I'll take it as it's an interesting topic. So Mirana, let me start with what you said. I thought that this was actually an excellent comment because, of course, a liberal definition of dignity is one that takes account of the dignity of the individual, rather than thinking of dignity as belonging to groups. What I find interesting about that is that, again, there's a very widespread view, which is very much promoted by some circles within Russia, and you hear a lot of these views coming from the West as well, that somehow Russian culture and history stands for collective identity, while you see in the West civilization is much more individualistic. And I think that this too is quite a false opposition. You know, I'm very skeptical that Russians have this sort of collective identity. It is a country where you have very high divorce rates and so on. So I think that this too is an opposition that, like many of these oppositions that I see as Russia versus the West, once you start looking into it, you see that things are much more complicated than they are. Also, the idea that everyone in the West is highly individualistic, you know, is also a great sort of idealization because, you know, you see that you have very conservative parts of society and so on and so forth. So I think that the interesting thing here, I think you're making a very valid point that when you define dignity, the sort of philosophical, historical definitions sort of go along the lines of the dignity of the individual versus dignity of groups. And I think that this is very true. At the same time, I think that when you think of this opposition between the collective identities of Russians and the individualism of people in the West, I think things are much more complicated, you know. So, okay. Now, just a second. Now, Eva, I think, again, this is a very good point because we all think of dignity and human rights as somehow belonging together. But my point, and this is not just my point, you know, scholars have written about that. There's a very well-known book, which I like very much, by Samuel Moyn. It's called Christian Human Rights. And in the book, he actually looks exactly at the moment at which these two very distinct discourses on dignity on the one hand and on rights on the other hand were brought together. And that happened relatively recently, in the 1940s, and it was first the wartime Pope that started using dignity and rights together for a very conservative religious agenda. So actually, in a way, if you think about the history of bringing these two terms together and fusing them, you know, it is very telling how it was first used. After that, this sort of, you know, thinking of dignity and rights together comes out in the UN Declaration. And I think it's so natural to the way we think about it that we sometimes forget that dignity is a concept that has a very, very long history. Part of it is a religious history, while rights has quite a distinct history. It's much more modern, it's much more secular, and they didn't always belong together. So I think it's something that needs to be, again, sort of addressed and thought through. So very quickly, Kirill, now, I think that actually what I just said to Eva somehow relates to the remark you made about these analogous cases during the Second World War in some way. But, you know, thanks for bringing it to my mind. My point, though, was that it's not the common way you usually think about that. Now, and lastly, Kim, I think that this is very true. I think that the whole history of the concept of dignity, on the one hand, you have this understanding of dignity as status, exactly like, you know, in an aristocratic society, you know, the higher you up, the more dignity you have. But I also think that this, rather than thinking about it, at least for me, it's been more useful and valuable to think of the history of the concept as not as one understanding following the other, but actually the way they coexist at the same time. Because, you know, I mostly know the theological writings on that. And I think it is quite striking that you see the same writer, Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century. He wrote probably the best known text on dignity. And you see how he's moving between what to me look like fundamentally different views on dignity. It's something everyone has, and it is a status symbol, as you're saying. Yeah, so, well, sorry. I think I took again a bit too long. Well.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much for your insightful comments and questions, and thank you, Nicolae Mitrokhin and Klemena Antonova, for your talk. Let's give them a pause.